Excellent, excellent. How's everyone doing? All right. So everyone, welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. For those who do not know, my name is Tommy J. Curry. I am the personal chair of Africana Philosophy and Black Male Studies at the University of Edinburgh. I would first like to thank our sponsors, the Center for Open Learning at the University of Edinburgh, for sponsoring this event this afternoon. As we know, sponsors are very important. They pay for things. And a warm welcome to the students from the center who have joined us today. So it is a pleasure for me to actually share this session with Dr. Grayling. Dr. Grayling is an author of over 30 books on philosophy. He is the current master of the New School of the Humanities and supernumerary fellow at St. Anne's College at Oxford. He's held multiple fellowships and positions in philosophical societies, but perhaps what's most important today is that he is the author of this book, The History of Philosophy. So he will lecture, or discuss rather, his findings and the attempts that he's made, in writing this book, the purpose of them, for about 30 or 40 minutes or so. And then we'll open it up for questions for the audience. All right? So join me in welcoming Dr. Grayling.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I always stand behind a lecture in case somebody throws a shoe. This is the George W. Bush lesson that we've learned. Well, as you heard Tommy say, 30 or 40 minutes to cover 2,500 years of philosophy from around the world. This is the result of the meanness of the Edinburgh Book Festival, because if they'd given us a few weeks to do this, then that would have been more to the point. But what I will do is talk about what the book attempts to do and say something about the premise on which it rests. The premise on which it rests is that there is a story about the great philosophical traditions. And the book is mainly about the Western philosophical tradition. But I peer over the hedge at some of the great philosophical traditions elsewhere, the Indian, the Chinese, the great contribution made by philosophers writing in Arabic or in Persian in the earlier part of the Middle Ages, as we think of them from the Western perspective, and also have a look at really sample some of the developments that are happening in philosophical thinking, because philosophy is not static, it's developing. And in fact, Tommy himself is a living embodiment of the great changes which are being introduced into thinking about philosophy. So, for example, philosophy from an African perspective, philosophy from the perspective of different groups and races, ethnicities, people who occupy different positions in the social order and the class and economic structures of societies. And these are very, very interesting developments. In order to appreciate them, in order to understand what these new developments and changes are, it is very good to have, as it were, the orthodox story, to know what that story is, and then one can see what the differences and innovations are. So in this book, I try to describe that story. And that is why, with a certain degree of hubris, I've called it The History of Philosophy. You may notice that my very distinguished predecessor, Bertrand Russell, of whom I'm a great admirer, called his book A History of Western Philosophy. So much more modest use of the indefinite article, and also a geographical restriction as well. That book, by the way, which Russell wrote during the course of the Second World War in the 1940s, it ends really in the early part of the 20th century. It ends with Russell's own contribution to philosophy. It is a book which you probably know. It's written with great wit and style. He was a marvelous stylist. It's also a book which, and I say this, having prefaced this remark with my tremendous admiration. In fact, I have a great big portrait of Russell in the hall of my college. It's not always very accurate. If he didn't like a philosopher, he gave him very, very short shrift. And, the challenge is, if you're going to write about the great story of philosophy, what you want to do, and it is such a relishable challenge to do this. This is one reason why I so loved writing this book, is to try to be clear, to try to be accurate, as well as succinct, so that anybody who reads the book can on the whole feel that they've been given a reliable insight into this extraordinary adventure, which is the adventure of philosophy. Now, I've been asked a few times how long did it take me to write this book, and I say, well, either 10 years or a lifetime, whichever you think is the more appropriate metric, really, for finding the resources for handling so many different thinkers and themes over such a long period of time. I always like to have at least 2 projects on the go. This is the explanation for being over-prolific. So to have a big background project that you can return to and revisit and continue your writing on. And this project was, for the last 10 years or so, that book. And when it was finished, I was appalled. I thought, oh my God, you know, this is a really great friend this book has been to me, and it's been a sort of comfort blanket and a nice place to visit. I go on holiday to that book, you know, when I'd finished writing another book. But I feel that in order to serve a cause, which is that most of the philosophers, even the greatest of the philosophers, most of them, didn't write for other professors of philosophy. You would have gone into a bookshop and you would have taken down a volume of contemporary philosophy, and you find that it's full of technicality and jargon, very long words like marmalade and corrugated iron and so on. And unless you are in charge of that jargon, you don't get access to the arguments. So it's important, really, that we should think of communicating this adventure, aspects of this adventure, to the general interested reader, to the beginning student, to somebody who would like to know this very, very, very important strand in the overall history of ideas. Because one has to remember this. Philosophy is a very, very consequential enterprise, and it is so for a good reason. Right up until the 19th century, the word philosophy meant rational inquiry, careful, systematic, rational inquiry, the attempt to make sense, not just of what we nowadays think are typical philosophical problems in the theory of knowledge or in ethics or political philosophy, but about everything. In fact, the word philosopher denoted, in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, what nowadays we call scientist. So any kind of interest, whether in the structure and properties of the material universe, or in the past and how we study the past, or in questions of society and political structure, anybody who was interested in those things was called a philosopher. And indeed, in antiquity, in the very roots of the great tradition of philosophy in classical Greece, we see the philosophers being interested in not just what we think of as philosophical problems, but in astronomy and in mathematics and the weather and just about everything you can think of. And as a result, out of these inquiries has come the more specialized knowledge. For example, in the 16th and 17th century, those philosophers who were interested in the nature, the structure of the material world, began to ask their questions in ways that were answerable. They began to make use of certain kinds of intellectual tools, in particular mathematics, to help them make sense of the phenomena they were examining. And that gave rise to the natural sciences. In the 17th century, the great century of the birth of science, 16th and 17th century, that came out of philosophy. In the 18th century, psychology. In the 19th century, sociology and empirical linguistics. In the 20th century, philosophers and logicians made great contributions to computing science, to cognitive science, to the development of thinking about AI. And to this very day, at this very day, philosophical ideas and ways of thinking and philosophers are making a contribution to the neurosciences and neuropsychology. So you can see that the philosophy is a very, very consequential enterprise, because it is the attempt to clarify the problem, to find the right way to deal with it, to find the right kinds of questions to ask so that they can be answered. But even though philosophy has given birth to most of the really significant and world-changing special disciplines, it's also the case that some of the problems that philosophy deals with, which are particularly intractable but particularly important to us, are perennial. The great question about how we're to live, what sort of people we should be, what values should shape and colour our lives as individuals and in our societies. These are questions that every generation has to ask. Every individual has to ask himself or herself these questions, and to look at some of the answers that have been given, some of the suggestions that have been made, and to parlay those into one's own experience and one's own outlook. So the philosophical enterprise is an important one, and therefore it is just as well that we are all of us philosophers. You know this when you're in the pub, as the evening goes on, etc. So you become more profound and you see more deeply into the problems of life. So to avail oneself of the great conversation that is philosophy, to know what our predecessors in the philosophical tradition have had to offer us in their perspectives, their suggestions, their ways of thinking about things, is enormously valuable to us. So we are all philosophers. We all benefit from helping ourselves to the great treasure store of ideas and ways of thinking and suggestions, even indeed the wrong turnings. And of course, as you know, there's a marvelous remark by the French poet Paul Valéry when he talks about really great difficulties, really great problems that we face. He said, a difficulty is a light. Because when you tackle a difficult problem, it sheds light. You learn so much in doing it. But even, he said, an insurmountable difficulty, one, a puzzle that you cannot crack, a question you cannot answer, even the endeavor to try to answer it or to crack that puzzle. Well, he said, that is like the sun, because it sheds so much illumination on us. You may know that John F. Kennedy had some wonderful speechwriters, and in the early 60s he talked about putting a man on the moon before the end of the decade. You may remember that. Actually, of course, the reason why he was doing that was because the Russians seemed to be getting ahead of the Americans, and so it was a, my rocket is bigger than yours kind of race between the US and the Soviet Union. But he said in that key speech, he said, we're going to put a man on the moon before the end of this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And when you do hard things, you grow. And indeed, in a way, that has been a key to all the impulse that has lain behind the philosophical quest from the very earliest times. The desire to understand, the desire to make sense, desire to penetrate things that seem difficult and dark and obscure. So, if we think about what philosophy is, now of course we are in one sense very familiar with it, but when you look across the great landscape of the history of philosophy, you see that philosophy comes down to two great questions. One question is, what is there? What is reality? What exists? What is existence? What is this place, this universe? Trying to understand the ultimate nature of reality. That's one great question. And the other great question is, what matters? What's of value? What's of importance in whatever exists? Now, if you look at these two great questions, you can see that it's pretty tough going to try and just answer them like that. I mean, imagine you go out into Princes Street with a clipboard and a pencil, and you stop passers-by and you ask them, what exists? And you hope they don't call a policeman or an ambulance or something. They're ready to discuss this with you. What are they going to say? They'll say something like, the Edinburgh tram and buses and the castle and so on. And you say, no, well, these things, of course, they exist, but they're complex objects. They're made out of simpler parts. What are those simpler parts? Now, if you've got this being Edinburgh, of course, you'll pretty soon be down to talking about quantum theory with the person you've stopped in Princes Street. But you might want to point out to the person who says, well, quantum phenomena are the ultimate constituents of the universe. You might want to say, well, Niels Bohr of quantum theory fame. By the way, little footnote, Niels Bohr was visited on several occasions, as you know, by Werner Heisenberg, who noticed that Bohr had a horseshoe nailed up outside the door of his study. And Heisenberg said to him, you don't believe in that stuff, do you? And Bohr said, no, of course not. But they say it works even if you don't believe it. Well, Bohr, you may remember, had this interpretation of quantum theory in which you actually require observations in order to collapse the wave function so that the cat is either definitely alive or dead and so on, you know, that stuff. So on your list of what exists in the universe out there in Princes Street in the rain, you would have to write quantum phenomena and physicists. Well, this is something that physicists would be very pleased to know, that they are absolutely, essentially part of reality. But it does seem vaguely odd. What would you put next? Number 2. Would you think that minds, mental phenomena, are different from physical phenomena? After all, the thought of afternoon tea doesn't have a weight or a color or a fragrance. It doesn't have a location. I mean, you might think it must have a location in the brain somewhere, but where? Is it behind your left ear or above the bridge of your nose and so on? It doesn't seem to have the same sorts of properties that physical things have. So are mental things, thoughts, memories, desires, intentions, are they different from sticks and stones and bricks and rivers? Well, if so, then you've committed yourself to the mind-body distinction. I don't know whether you know, but that in modern philosophy, the great architect, as it were, of debate about the mind-body problem was René Descartes. Everybody's heard of him. His great slogan, "I drink, therefore I am," is on every pub wall in the country. The rather sad thing that happened to him was that he died in Sweden, having been invited there by Queen Christina to be her court philosopher. He took so long thinking about whether he should go or not that by the time he got there, she had forgotten that she had asked him and had lost her interest in philosophy anyway. So, she heard that he liked to stay in bed until noon every day, and to play a trick on him, she said she wanted her tutorials at 5 o'clock in the morning, which killed him. I mean, literally, he got a chill, it turned into pneumonia, and he died. She was mortified at having killed the most famous philosopher in Europe of the day, and she was going to build him a great mausoleum, but she forgot about that too. So 17 years after his death, he was exhumed and taken back to France. But on the way, somebody pinched his head. This is because people like the heads of geniuses. They think somehow or other if you could look at them, you would understand their thought. Einstein's brain is in a vat somewhere, and people go and look at that in the endeavor to understand general relativity. Well, to this day, Descartes' body is buried in the church of Saint-Germain. Next time you're in Paris and you're sitting in the Deux Magots Café, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, his body is just across the street in that church. But his head is in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. So in death, the mind-body problem is exemplified by Descartes. So you can see, you've got number 2. Number 2 on your list are minds different from bodies, or they're the same thing, and so on. Number 3, okay, now you think, if you're going to be a dualist about mind and body, why not reintroduce angels and archangels, principalities and powers, gods and goddesses, get a rush of blood to the head, you begin to think that abstract entities like numbers and universals exist. You could write all those down, but notice this, that you've still only got 3 or 4 items on your list. And that on this day, which I believe is the 23rd of August, 2019, we still do not know. Even the most accomplished Nobel Prize-winning particle physicist doesn't know the ultimate nature of reality. We still don't know what ultimately exists and what the universe is really like in itself. That's a pretty extraordinary thought, isn't it? To know that with all our theories, even our most powerfully attested and supported theories that enable us to fly in aeroplanes and to use laptop computers and to cure diseases with antibiotics and so on, we still don't know what the ultimate nature of reality is. And as to the other question, the question of what really matters, the question of value, the ethical question, there too, we argue with one another. What is good? What is right? Different societies, different outlooks, different ideologies, different religions will compete with one another over important matters like gay rights and the position of women in society and stem cell research, and all those sorts of issues are very, very radically affected by the kinds of answers that we try to give to the question of value. And you can see that these 2 great questions, the question of the nature of reality and the question of value, are connected. Imagine that in answering the question about the nature of reality, you do include transcendent or supernatural agencies or beings, a god, for example, or gods. And you add certain other assumptions, that the gods are interested in us. They're interested in what we eat and what we wear and who we marry and how we behave ourselves. Then That fact about the universe makes a big difference to the question of value, to how we're to live. But if your answer to the question about the nature of reality doesn't include the existence of a God or gods who are interested in us and so on, if you just think of the universe as a great realm of natural law, one that could be described in a finished or completed physics, then the question of value is the question that we have to answer. We have to make up our minds how we're going to live, how we're going to treat one another, how we're going to formulate good principles on which to relate to our fellows in the human story. And we ultimately are responsible for creating the good in our world. So the two questions are very, very dramatically connected with one another, and that is partly the reason why they matter so much. In a sense, you can think of the great question of value as an urgent question, one that we need to answer, and therefore we also need to answer the question of reality. Now, your experience in Princes Street with the passers-by will have taught you that you cannot just ask the two great questions, what is real and what matters, that you have to break them down. This is the great thing about philosophy, is that you have to sneak up on these problems from behind when they're not looking. You've got to try and climb in through the kitchen window when they're out. You've got to try and get at them in a way which makes them more tractable. So you've got to break them down. For example, the nature of reality. Well, how are we going to know what reality is? Well, what is knowledge? Well, maybe knowledge is the kind of belief which has a chance of being true. Okay, so what is truth? You're going to use reason in making inferences from your observations about the world. What do we mean by right reasoning, good reasoning? You can see that question, the metaphysical question about the nature of reality, begins to break down very quickly into questions about the nature of knowledge, of reason, of truth, of the sorts of concepts that we use when we're thinking about the world. And even those concepts themselves come to be contested or challenged. Whose concepts are they? Whose reasoning is it? What is the most fundamental and most trustworthy logic that we can use? So this becomes a more fragmented, if you like, or more various set of questions that we have to examine and try to answer in the process of trying to come to an understanding of what the universe is. And here, when we think about questions of value, we need to ask ourselves a whole set of sub-questions. We need also, of course, to be clear about reason and about the idea of truth and the idea of objectivity, because we're going to ask about our values. Are there objective values in the world that are universal, that apply to everybody? Or are values entirely a function of what society, what ethnicity, what bit of history you're in? All these problems about whether you should use the character of an individual or the outcomes of the actions that the individual performs, which is the thing that you want to measure when you are ambitious to measure value. So both these questions, as it were, break down into other questions which we need to examine too. And when you look at the history of philosophy, you see that as philosophy has developed, so the examination of these, as it were, sub-questions have come more and more into focus and constitute a great part of the substance or the matter of the history of philosophy. Well, in the Western tradition, we conventionally give the honor of being the father of philosophy, the person who counts as the first philosopher of our tradition, to a man called Thales, who lived about 585 BCE, before the Common Era. That's in the early 6th century before the Common Era. And the reason that he is given this honorific, it's pretty arbitrary. I mean, obviously, there were people in the 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years of history before his time who almost certainly had the leisure, the opportunity, and the curiosity and intelligence to ask the kinds of questions that he asked and to come up with answers in the way that he came up with them. But he's the first person we know of who did this, because he is cited and praised indeed by his successors in the philosophical tradition as being this person. What he did was he asked that question: what is the nature of reality? What is the principle? From what does reality come? In ancient Greek, the word arche denotes this idea of the principle or source of reality. And so he asked himself this question: what is the arche of the universe? And the answer he came up with was this. He said, the universe is made of water. Water is the origin of all reality and its substance. Now, of course, there's rather few people around today who would agree with that, although, as it happens, water is a very important subject, especially in dry parts of the world. But did you know that 70% of the fresh water consumed in the United Kingdom is imported in the form of fresh fruit and vegetables grown in countries with a water shortage? So you can see Thales was right to pick up on water as being an important issue, even if it isn't the principle of the universe. But that's what he thought it was. Now you ask yourself the question, why did he think it was water? Well, because he looked around him and he noticed. He lived in Miletus, by the way, on the eastern margin of the Aegean Sea. And of course, there was the sea. The rain came out of the sky, flowed out of the rivers. It was in your veins. It was in a tree when you chopped the tree. It's essential to life. You cannot live without it. He even thought that water produces soil, because when the Nile flooded every year, hundreds of millions of tons of silt came pouring out of the delta of the Nile. So he thought that water produced silt. But above all, water was the only thing he knew capable of taking all three forms of solid, liquid, and gas. Solid when it freezes into ice, liquid in its natural state, and gas when it boils away into steam. So it is metamorphic, it is ubiquitous, and it is essential. Therefore, it must be the arche of the universe. So his thinking wasn't, completely lunatic. But what's really interesting about it is that he didn't give an answer predicated on ancient scriptures or legends or myths or gods and goddesses creating the world. I mean, not very long before Thales' time, Hesiod wrote, the Theognis and the Works and Days. And in the Theognis, he talks about night, lying with sky, and sky giving birth to earth, and blah, blah. And that kind of explanation is a very natural one for human beings to want. We all want a story, a narrative. We want to be able to encapsulate things that make some sense to us of what the universe might be like and where it came from. But Thales didn't appeal to those sorts of considerations. He did his thinking on the basis of his observations. He used observation and reason, and he came up with a candidate for the stuff of the universe, which for somebody living in the early 6th century BCE has a certain plausibility. And that is why he is chosen as the first philosopher, and why he exemplifies something about what the great philosophical tradition is about. It's about observation and reason. It's about trying to think things through. It's about examining the evidence that we have and trying to make best sense of it. It is also, therefore, about examining assumptions that we might make, or the easy, quick answers that we might want to give to things. I often say to students of mine how important the attack on assumptions is in philosophy. So I give them the example. I say, I had spent quite a lot of my life in Oxford. I was a student there, and I taught there for a number of years. And everybody's heard of Oxford, and some people have heard of that other place in the damp meadows of eastern England. And we point out that Oxford people always notice about Cambridge people that what happens in Cambridge is claimed by the Cambridge people to apply to the entire universe. This is true of Isaac Newton, who you remember allegedly was hit on the head by a falling apple, which made him look up at the sky and ask, why doesn't the moon fall to the earth? And that was the beginning of his thinking that eventuated in the inverse square law of gravitation, which, like a good Cambridge man, he applied to the entire universe. Now, if he were here at the Edinburgh Book Festival, I'm absolutely certain that this audience would pounce on him and say, oh, Mr. Newton, or Sir Isaac Newton, why do you think that the law of gravity applies to the entire universe? You sneakily, of course, you know better than him because you know that it doesn't. So on the event horizon of a black hole and so on, the laws of physics don't behave in quite the same way as they do elsewhere. But what would he say? He would say, well, I think the laws of physics apply everywhere because the universe is the same everywhere. And you say, well, why do you think that? That's a big assumption. What would he say? Well, he would say, the universe is the same everywhere because it was created by God, and God is an economical workman. Now you would say to him, hang on a tick, there are at least three big assumptions there. First, that the universe was created by a God. Secondly, that she's an economical work person. Anyway, what you notice about this assumption of Newton's is that in the very foundations of classical Newtonian physics, there is a theological assumption, which, whether or not it is correct, at least needs to be challenged or explored. And that's one of the key things about philosophy. If it's about observation and reason, if it's about evidence and reason, if it's about trying to think things through, make sense of things, if it's about the search for the kinds of concepts that we could apply in order to try to clarify our understanding and to organize our thinking about things, then you have to be pretty sure that you are not just importing assumptions that could be very distorting. After all, every single human being on this planet was born wearing a pair of spectacles, double glazed in some cases. Now, if you were born with a pair of pink spectacles strapped to your nose, and only at the age of 20 did you have the spectacles taken off, it would be tremendously surprising to find that the world wasn't a nice shade of pink, that it had all sorts of other colors in it as well. And this idea of the concepts, the conceptual frameworks that we are given by our society, our parents, our education, our experience, if we never challenged it, if we never asked questions about it, then we would never think straight or cleanly about the world. So again, one thing that we learn from the example of Thales is he didn't accept any of the assumptions that his contemporaries and forebears would perhaps quite naturally have assumed, namely, that there are agencies at work in the world. I mean, think of mythology. Mythology tells us that the nymphs in the streams and the dryads in the trees and the gods in the winds and so on, that the world works by means of agencies. Agencies bring things about, make them happen. They are the causal factor in the world. This is a generalization from our own experience of agency. Pick up a stone and throw it in the river, you make a splash, you did that. So somebody or something must be making the thunder sound and the wind blow. But Thales didn't use those assumptions. He began from observation and reason. And that is why he is regarded as the first philosopher. Now, very quickly, in the tradition of the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, these are the ones who followed Thales, people like Anaximenes and Anaximander, and two very, very great figures in philosophy, Parmenides and Heraclitus. You may have come across them, the cosmic fragments of Heraclitus. Parmenides, who thought that if anything is real, it cannot be a composite thing. It cannot be made of parts. It must be a single thing. It cannot change or move, because change and movement are destabilizing and ultimately destructive. So if anything is real, it must be eternal, it must be perfect, it must be unchanging. And therefore the way the world seems to us, with all its plurality and diversity and movement and change, must be an illusion. And from that moment, from that Parmenidean argument about the distinction between appearance and reality, there has been an immense philosophical debate about how we are to get beyond the appearances to try to understand reality. And indeed, the rise of the natural sciences, trying to penetrate into the microstructure of reality, or thinking about the nature of the universe on the very larger scales, takes us well beyond how the world appears to us as creatures of the shape and size and endowments, eyes and ears and so on, that we have. So up until the time of Socrates, the great endeavor of the philosophers of that early period in the beginning chapters of the history of philosophy were interested in this great question about the nature of reality. Socrates lived at a very important moment from the point of view of a great change of thinking across the major civilizations, really, because Socrates was born 10 years after Confucius died in China, and either 10 years after the death or after the birth of Gautama, the Buddha. We don't quite know the Buddha's dates accurately enough, but he was a near contemporary of the Buddhas as well. And what you notice about Socrates and Confucius and the Buddha is that they were all philosophers. They weren't priests or preachers or prophets. They didn't claim to have been given revelations by a deity. They didn't offer a means of getting into an afterlife of bliss in heaven. They were philosophers. Of course, the Buddha has been turned into a sort of godlike figure by some of the traditions of Buddhism after his time, and we understand the psychology of that. You've all seen the movie The Life of Brian, you know, the shoe. Some great teacher or thinker, and therefore apotheosis is a natural thing to do. But they were philosophers, and they were all three of them thinking about the same family of questions, and that family of questions was the good life and the good society. How should we live? What really matters? What's of value? What governs rightly and properly the way we act and behave and relate to others? The great ethical questions. Remembering that the word ethical comes from the ancient Greek word ethos, which means character, so it's really about what sort of people we should be and how should we live. And all three of them were interested in that question, the question of value, the other great question. In the case of the Indian traditions of philosophy, and there's one thing which is so interesting is that, like the members of the Western tradition of philosophy, they were interested in the question of metaphysics. But in giving the answer, a very similar answer to the one given by Parmenides, that the world is an illusion, they concluded that therefore the right thing to strive to do is to escape the world of appearance. And they thought that you could do this by escaping the cycle of rebirth, by escaping the condition of existence altogether, that bliss was non-existence. You've all had that experience after a really good night in the pub, haven't you? So that idea, the sort of soteriological idea that salvation consists in ceasing to exist by escaping the pain, the suffering, the endurance, the durance of existence. That's not a conclusion that the Western philosophers came to. They thought that within the context of the metaphysics that they were developing and thinking about, the question of good lives and good societies had to be answered on their own terms. Quite different, you see, from religions. Religion and religious answers to these sorts of questions really lie off to one side from the way that the philosophers in these great traditions were thinking about it. In China, Confucius, who, as I say, was a very near contemporary of Socrates, was, like a lot of others of his contemporaries at that time, thinking about the question of how could you ensure the good society, the good state. And they believed that this was the good state would be the result of a good ruler, of somebody who could set an example that would be followed by others, that, as it were, goodness would flow down from the exemplar that the ruler would be for his society, rather as the father would be for his family. You notice it's very male orientated. But this idea that proper behavior, proper observance of the rights, of the customs of a society would ensure a good and flourishing society. All these ideas were very significant for a different way of thinking about the question: what matters, what's of value, what is the good life and the good society. So there you see, at that period in history, we're talking about 2,500 years ago, when the great traditions of philosophy were really getting going in all these civilizations, that these two great questions, what exists and what matters, lay at the very heart, at the foundation of the philosophical enterprise. And now you can scan, as we are on our satellite here looking down at the history of philosophy, we scan this great period of time, these 2.5 millennia, and we see the ancient Greek tradition flourishing and developing. We see the rise of the post-Aristotelian ethical schools, Stoics and the Epicureans. You know, Stoicism was the outlook of educated people for more than half a millennium, more than 500 years in the Hellenic and Roman worlds. And you know that Stoicism is a very noble outlook. It says, with respect to things that we cannot control or influence, tsunamis, old age, disease, earthquakes, we must face them with courage. But with regard to things that we have some influence over, our own fears, appetites, desires, we must try to achieve some degree of self-mastery. And to have courage towards the outer and some self-mastery of the inner means that we can live with nobility. That was the Stoic conception. It's what's given rise, by the way, to a certain use of the term philosophy. I like to tell my students the story of the two old ladies on the Glasgow bus, overheard, one saying to the other, "My dear, you must be philosophical about this, don't give it another thought." Well, that comes from Stoicism. And would exactly sum up. Tommy's looking at me because he's been looking at the clock as well. I'll be with you in a second. So that's an example of how an influence from one of the great ethical schools of ancient times persists in the very language that we use today. Between the 4th and the 14th century in Europe, the church became dominant. You will remember that the Emperor Constantine, in the Edict of Milan, 313 AD, or CE as we call it now, had decriminalized Christianity. And in 380 AD, the Emperor Theodosius II made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire and outlawed all others. And for the next couple of centuries, there was a tremendous attack, really, on classical civilization. Over 90% of the literature of classical antiquity was lost. Many of the temples and artworks were broken down and reused to build churches and so on. So there was a big wall separates us in a way from much of the thought and literature of classical times. I mean, think of it, we know only about 7 plays of Aeschylus, and we know over 70 titles of his works, and you can generalize that to most of what happened. We almost lost all the works of Aristotle in the same conditions. So in that period of the great dominance of the church, about the only philosophy that was done was philosophy annexed to the theological needs of people like Augustine at the beginning and Aquinas much later on. And of course there were some important contributions that they made. But it wasn't really until the Renaissance and the beginning of the modern period in the 16th, 17th century that a revival of the thinking of classical antiquity was made possible. Hume, you may remember, your own wonderful David Hume here, said how he wished he had been brought up as a child on the writings of Cicero instead of on whatever it was that the Domine had prescribed as a reading for infant school members. And that is an example of how the recovery in the Renaissance and later of the thinking of classical times fertilized the great flowering of philosophy that we've seen since then. And the last century, the last 100 years or so, 20th century and now in the 21st century, we've seen perhaps the greatest efflorescence of philosophical thinking and contribution to philosophical thought in all the history of philosophy. And what I've attempted to do in the book is to provide a basis for understanding that, a platform for being able to you can stand on that platform and look at the landscape of philosophy and see what's happening in it, see what has happened in it recently, and as I say, to peek over the hedge into the neighboring terrains of Indian and Chinese and Arab Persian philosophy also, so that one can see something of this incredible adventure that humanity has been on, trying to make sense of our world and ourselves by trying to answer these two great questions about reality and about value. Thank you, everybody.
So everyone get mics on? So we'll take a few questions from the audience. We'd ask after the Q&A, if everyone can stay in their seats while Dr. Breland moves to a book signing, which will be held next door. So questions?
Thank you very much, sir, for a very lucid lecture on such a comprehensive subject. I'm kind of interested in your opinions of the future of philosophy. Now that we have that great philosopher in the White House who's established the concept of fake news, and also in relation to the internet, is the internet helping to expand truth and knowledge, or is it doing the opposite?
Well, I'm inclined to think that although the internet has wonderful uses, I mean, after all, One can repeat endlessly what is true about it, that at the press of a button, the speed of light, you can get information about all sorts of things. Equally, at the press of a button, the speed of light, you can get misinformation about anything that you care. I've often described it as the biggest lavatory wall in history, on which everybody's scribbled their graffiti and their nonsense and their falsehoods and so on. Happily, not even Mr. Trump, despite his most recent claims about his status as the second coming and so on, is likely to live forever, thank heavens. So I think humanity may survive Mr. Trump. I hope so. He is a bit near those buttons. And the internet itself, with all the rubbish on it, has taught us something important, which is that the great value of thinking critically. I mean, it seems such a cliche, but to be good at evaluating sources of information and claims that are made, to be able to apply philosophical styles of thought to analyze and to sift and to take the measure of something, to see what it is you're going to accept or work with or premise in your further thinking. And this is something now we know. You know, it used to be the case, you remember in the old-fashioned education, some of us who can no longer quite remember the details of our 21st birthday. We lived in an era when teachers downloaded from their neck-top computers to our neck-top computers in the classroom. Well, now everybody's got a laptop computer, so you can find out anything you want about history and geography. What our education needs to do now is teach people how to make use of that information and how to analyze it. So we've learned from the tsunami of fake news and distortions and all the terrible things that it's produced, and I'm going to be completely neutral about this, the horrors of Brexit, for example, all the result of this. And we now know that what we need is more philosophy.
Thank you, Professor Grayling. I have not heard a more eloquent lecture since the late Professor Joseph Campbell, so thank you for that today. You mentioned Paul Valery, and Paul Valery, of course, wrote, "The trouble with the future is it's not what it used to be." So given that, what question should philosophers ask so that we avoid the mess that we're in now through the remainder of the 21st century, beyond our political upheaval, the problems, of course, with climate change? Thank you.
Well, as mentioned, of course, the perennial questions still need to be asked and answered. They're still there. But you're absolutely right, and so is Paul Valery, that as we go forward in time, so more and more challenges, new, unexpected, and difficult challenges come on board. I mean, one rather familiar one by now surely is the fact that artificial intelligence, that machine learning systems and so on, these things have arrived already. They're already working out how much premium we should pay on our insurance policies, and maybe even helping us with medical diagnostics and all sorts of things. So the question arises, how are we to make a place for them in our moral universe? Is it the case that if a system that has taught itself to model itself in its universe of operation, so an intelligent system that can do that, which has some kind of self-representation, would switching it off at the wall be tantamount to murder? Do we have any ethical responsibilities to these systems that are now coming on stream? That would be one. The other is, in thinking about climate change, for example, what one notices this, that the great anxiety about climate change is the effect that it's going to have on us human beings. The planet, of course, would recover eventually if we wiped ourselves out, then give or take a few million years or hundreds of million years. The planet would restore itself. It would be a different place because we would have wiped out a lot of species along with our own species. And it is that moral responsibility to species, to our children and grandchildren who would inherit a wasteland if we don't do something about what we're doing, that is the most urgent ethical question so far as climate change is concerned. But it is a bit of a self-regarding problem, isn't it? So we have to put it into the perspective of universal history as well as of human history. So new challenges come up all the time, new technologies, new ways of doing things, new insights. As a collective, we are incredibly good at doing ourselves a lot of harm, but also recognizing that there really is a need for thinking afresh about ourselves, but recognizing also some of the problems that we have created and which are among us almost before we realize them.
We think about artificial intelligence and the actual artificial nature of it. What do you think actually it is? Is it a progression of where we're going? Will artificial intelligence breed almost like the philosopher of the future, the perfect philosopher?
Well, you know, of course, the Hitchhiker's Guide gave us a little sort of preview of this. What's the life, universe, and everything? Answer is 42, but what's the question? We all remember. We remember that, and it is actually awfully prescient, because if some of these systems become more intelligent than we are, and therefore are capable of making themselves even more intelligent, and this happens, you know, exponentially, increase in degree of intelligence. One of the great anxieties is if such a system asks itself the question, what is the most pesky and disruptive thing in the world today? Well, that's going to be very, very bad news for us, because it wouldn't take such a system very long to get rid of us. On the other hand, such a system might think to itself, these poor benighted creatures, what they need is a benevolent dictator to look after them all. And we may actually have succeeded in creating a deity of the kind that we've often longed to see exist. I don't know. So, you know, before the First World War, people noticed that biplanes flew better than monoplanes. So they predicted that the airplanes of the future would have 12 wings. This is how safe and reliable it is to predict anything about the future. So I think what we're going to have to do is we are going to have to challenge ourselves with the following task. And by the way, I've very selfishly given what I'm just about to say the name Grayling's Law, okay? And it is this. Anything that can be done will be done. Genetic engineering, making babies in the Petri dish that are 6'5" tall with IQs of 3 million and so on and so on. Anything that can be done will be done, even if we try to outlaw it or stop it. Bad people or rich people, they're not quite the same thing, will do it. New technologies like weapon systems, which are autonomous, which have AI built into them to go and seek out the enemy and get rid of them, those weapon systems are already being developed. AI of any degree of intelligence and of magnitude of capability will come. We will not be able to stop it. So what we've got to do is we've got to ask ourselves, how are we going to manage it? How are we going to approach it? How are we going to live with it? That's our big challenge at the moment, because we live on the cusp of a world massively threatened by climate change, rapidly developing all these new technologies which are already changing our lives. We live sort of right on the trembling edge of something which is scarcely imaginable. And we just have to ask ourselves, how are we going to cope with that? How are we going to manage that? And perhaps, above all, a question that the ancients asked themselves too. How are we as individuals going to live with ourselves internally, to find the strength and to find the fortitude to nevertheless try to live well?
Thank you very much. I think that it's a wonderful project to try to do the whole historical treatment. Most philosophers, including myself, focus on just one philosopher, John Stuart Mill. But I want to ask you a question about Buddhism, because in importing Buddhist concepts into Western mind, it's easy to lose track. And I wonder if you could say something more about what you mean about escaping existence or ceasing to exist, because that just sounds nihilistic in itself. And what Buddha, because nothing ceases to exist, it transforms, it changes, everything is always changing. So ceasing to be reborn does not mean ceasing to exist. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that so it doesn't sound completely nihilistic.
In my understanding of what the Buddhist tradition in its origins and indeed in its later development seeks, is not quite the same thing that was sought by some of the other traditions, Indian philosophy traditions, which was sort of take up or rehabilitation into what exists, into the great oneness of the universe. So to cease to be an individual consciousness, self-aware, by becoming at one with reality. In the case of Buddhism, the metaphysics of Buddhism consist in a denial of the fact that there is such a thing, that the whole of apparent existence is merely an appearance. And nirvana, that is the desired end state, is a complete annihilation of selfhood, of self-consciousness, of awareness of oneself as an existing thing. So actually, it embraces a nihilism, because what it wants is the nothingness that release consists in. Okay. That's my reading of him, and read the book and then and see whether the argument that I set out from him there.
Other questions? Green shirt?
Thank you. I was wondering what you saw the relationship between neuroscience and philosophy as, and whether you saw kind of like a synthesis coming between two, or whether you thought neuroscience would encroach on the realm of philosophy. I'm thinking particularly of like books like Oliver Sacks' The Theory of Mind and Identity, and like Sam Harris working on ethics.
Well, I think there's an enormous amount for philosophers to learn from advances in neuroscience. It's already the case that by using functional MRI scanning, a great deal has been learned about correlations between activations of certain structures in the brain and certain kinds of mental capacities and exercises. So an enormous amount has been learned there. There are the skeptics who say that the use of those techniques, brain scanning techniques, is a very, very expensive and high-tech version of phrenology, because what you're looking at is sort of massive structures in the brain, whereas the microstructure of the brain, of course, is incredibly complex. And trying to locate certain structures or certain functions, certain activities of the brain is instantiating particular emotions or particular thoughts or particular memories is a much, much more difficult and challenging task. But all the evidence seems to suggest that mental life is causally connected to neural activity in the central nervous system, and especially its upper reaches. And therefore, an understanding of the seat of consciousness and the seat of mentation is going to be sort of massively informed by what we learn about what's happening in the brain. I suppose the real dilemma that the research project of neuropsychology and neurophilosophy face is whether or not you can achieve a smooth, remainderless reduction from psychological vocabularies to neurological vocabularies. And part of the difficulty there is well explained by considering this example. Suppose you have two people standing at the side of a field, and there's a set of events on that field. One of them is a physicist who describes that set of events in terms of bodies moving at certain velocities, interacting according to the principles of mechanics, emitting radiation at certain frequencies, and so on. The other person is a sociologist who describes it as a rugby match. Now, in the vocabulary of the sociologist, team, try, penalty, scrum, and so on, there are no words or concepts which take a smooth translation into the language of physics, and vice versa. Is it therefore the case that to talk about intention, memory, desire, hope, love, grief, and to talk about the activation of neurons, the function of the synapse, the structures in the occipital region of the brain instantiating visual experience, is it possibly the case that you're going to get from one vocabulary to the other without any kind of remainder? That is the big challenge that philosophy faces in thinking about what it can learn from neuroscience.
Last question.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you could tell us what was the most surprising thing you learned about the history of philosophy from writing the book?
Well, the most interesting thing that I learned from it was that that very early argument of Parmenides, which is so influential on Plato and on Plato's metaphysics, indeed on the metaphysics of all his successors. The argument that reality must be unitary, there must be one ultimate thing that is capable of explaining all the, he said, misleading phenomena of plurality and change and so on, that assumption persists in our thinking about the world. Now, if you ask a physicist, there must be some physicists in this audience, why they would like to unify the four forces of nature, gravitation and the two nuclear forces and electromagnetic force. The electromagnetic force and the weak nuclear force have been unified by Weinberg and various others, but the impulse there is to reduce it to find one force. Or string theory, superstrings, will be the one thing there is from which all the diversity and plurality of nature comes. Why one force? Why not 17 and a half? Why just one kind of phenomenon, superstrings? Why not lots of ice creams and physicists and elementary particles as well? Well, I mean, there are good motivations, looking for simplicity, looking for elegance in the equations, looking for beauty, but those things are extra theoretical criteria. And the drive to try to unify, to find ultimately one thing and to simplify theory is motivated by something outside science itself. It's not as though the phenomena tell us that there is one underlying reality, but it is a very, very, very deep philosophical impulse. And thinking about all the different metaphysical theories that came after the pre-Socratic moment, I noticed how influential those insights of Parmenides had been. I think we need to stop. Yeah.
We're out of time. So if you would help me thank Dr. Grayling once again.
Thanks, Tommy. Thank you so much.